Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Street Peace Coalition on CAN TV 21, Channel 21 on your Comcast station if you live in Chicago. Those of you who are viewing us via Facebook live stream and Instagram, welcome as well. We thank you for tuning in. If this is your first time, welcome. Repeat viewers, welcome back. This is the weekly show of the Street Peace Coalition. This is our third season. The Street Peace Coalition is a grassroots community-based violence prevention and intervention effort. And each week we come to you to talk about issues related to violence. I'm going to go to our overhead. The Street Peace Coalition is a volunteer organization comprised mainly of black men from the south and west sides of Chicago. We'd like for you to get involved. Those of you who feel pain by the violence in Chicago, we are a viable group, organization for you to get involved with. You can check us out on Facebook. You can check out our website and see the type of work we are doing by visiting us either via our website or on social media and by tuning in to this show. This season we've started out by detailing what I term the seven-headed monster, the seven key institutions that are directly responsible for the perpetuation of violence in the black community via an assault on the black family and specifically black men. So I've talked about the Chicago Police Department and the fact that society has a crime and punishment philosophy when it comes to dealing with black people, especially young black boys and black men. So we looked at CPD, we looked at CPS, Chicago Public Schools. We've talked about the Chicago Housing Authority. We've talked about the Department of Children and Family Services. We've looked at IDOC. We've gone all the way up to look at the federal government in terms of the DEA, the ATF, all the way into the White House and the budgetary priorities and the nature of the operations of all of these institutions and how they target black males in particular in a way that exacerbates violence in the black community. And so, as I said, you know, here in Chicago, we've had somewhere around 580 people killed this year, shot and killed. We've had over 600 some odd homicides and well over 3,000 people murdered, some by shooting, stabbing, and otherwise in Chicago. Violence is an issue in Chicago, especially in the black community on the south and west sides of Chicago. So these institutions that I've talked about have capitalized on creating a mindset, a culture, a way of life predicated upon white male supremacy, capitalism, poverty. They've created these conditions and then benefited from these conditions and have created industries around these conditions that make it very unlikely that these conditions will change anytime soon until there is a dramatic restructuring of society. And so these institutions have decimated the traditional values of black people centered around the nuclear family, centered around the traditional family of one man, one woman, and the children in the home, and has motivated us, incentivized us in our community to go away from this way of life as a tradition. And so I want to pivot tonight with the short time that I have from talking about these external white male dominated, run, engineered, designed institutions that I just mentioned, to talk a little bit about the black family, because this is critical to us taking control and empowering ourselves to fight against the reality that I just articulated. We have power as a community. We have the ability to exact change in our community in spite of the established agenda of these other external institutions. Sometimes the cure is simple. And even though most of us think it's about if we have more jobs and more money, we won't have crime, I want to challenge you to understand that that's an oversimplification, that is misdirection, and that is the solution of someone who really does not understand human nature or human development. Because in the aftermath of chattel slavery from 1865 all the way through to 1965, black people were in deep, deep, deep poverty. And even though we had black on black crime, it was nothing compared to what is going on today. Even though we were plagued in the aftermath of chattel slavery with intense low self-esteem, with intense identity crisis, not knowing whether we were Negroes, colored people, black people, or what have you, not really knowing ourselves, we still, the number one driving force moving from 1865 to 1965 among black people was the desire to create family, to engage in the practice of marriage, and then to find productive work and build a stable family life. This is, by all accounts of all scholarship and researchers will agree on this fact, that 80% or more of all black children during that period of 1865 to 1965 were born to married couples. After that time, something began to set in. So I see I have a caller. Caller, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. How you doing, my friend? This is Ray.
All right, Ray, I'm doing good.
You know what? I disagree with you just a little bit. Right now, what I take from what you're saying is that an African American man or an African American young man, when he's born, is destined to be grown up and get in trouble. That's not right. You know what? You got to have a little bit about the family. If he comes from a good family, like you are, you know, there's so many African American people that have made it. Because they had a family structure. So it hurts me when you say all African American men and young men are destined.
I never said that, Ray. I never said that. Maybe you misheard me. But in fact, I've been building a case that the black family is the key to reducing violence in the black community. And so maybe you misunderstood, or maybe you misheard me. But as a young black man myself, growing up in the South and West sides of Chicago, my life experiences alone would preclude me from making such an asinine statement. So please follow me. Follow the logic of my argument, please. I'm saying I started out talking about these external white institutions that have an agenda on how they handle, treat, educate, miseducate, how they police and deal with young black people in terms of a crime and punishment philosophy and outlook that's predicated on white male supremacy. I've talked about that for the last 4 or 5 weeks. And I said tonight I'm trying to pivot to talk about the black family and the power that the black family has to remediate what we're doing to ourselves in the community in spite of the agenda of these other organizations. And so as you called, I was talking about the fact that from 1865 moving forward, one of the driving dynamics of black life was the desire to marry, to create family, to have children, to find productive work, create business enterprise, self-employment, etc., to build black families. And if you look at black life and the stats of black life from 1865 up until about 1960, going towards 65, you'll find that 80% or more of our children were born to married homes. You will find that black people had a certain attitude and mentality because of the hostility of our environment and the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, it's lynching, etc. We understood that we had to have each other's back. We understood that we had an open enemy, an obvious enemy called white racism. And so it bonded us together. So we had a desire to be mannerable people. We had a desire to be dignified people. We had a desire to be people of culture and civilization and high standards of human conduct and behavior. And so these were the dominant values of black life up in that period. And so, but it was also in that period that certain practices and policies came into play that began to chip away at the stability of the black family. And so moving into the 60s on into the 70s, where marriage now became under assault, where now it was about corporate advancement, the pursuit of materialism, money, degrees, and lettering over family as the highest pursuit, regardless of financial or educational status. Values began to shift, okay? And so when we get to the 80s now, we find that there is an effort afoot not only to give a stigma, a negative stigma, on the relationship between men and women with the women's liberation movement, which had a wing of women who were very hostile toward traditional marriage. This was going on in the white community, and it became very infectious in the black community, combined with the assault on black men, black manhood. We found that our marriages, the traditional thing that kept us intact as a community, black marriages, now was being eroded in the community, going into the mid to late 60s into the 70s. Okay, I'm talking about cultural phenomena, social phenomenon. And if you don't believe me, these are not my facts. This is me reporting facts that I've studied and that scholars have studied and reported on. Okay, and so now, today, we fast forward, having survived, some of us, the 80s, the mid-80s into the 90s, what we call the cocaine or crack epidemic, where crack cocaine became readily available. In fact, it was promoted out of the White House, out of the federal government. The black community became the dumping grounds for this. The black community became a place where open market drugs was wholesale. And so now grandmothers, grandfathers, mothers, aunties, uncles, traditional elders, and adults who kept themselves as a role model and a standard of behavior for their children now were becoming drug addicts. The black family began to deteriorate under the weight of this wholesale mass distribution of this cheap drug in the black community. And so it funded the prison industrial complex, and it drove the breakdown of the black family. And so now you have children born in the 90s all the way to the early 2000s that come up without the benefit of the cultural legacy of black people from 1865 to 1965. You have a shifting now of the culture of what it means to be a parent, what it means to have a family, what it means to be a parent. All of these things began to shift under the weight of the practices and policies, some known and some not so known, by the previous institutions that I mentioned, starting with Chicago Police Department, Chicago Public Schools, Department of Housing, Children and Family Services, all the way up to ATF, DEA, White House. These are practices and policies, okay, that allowed the proliferation of drugs and guns in the black community, because we don't control the distribution of any of the manufacture or the distribution of any of these things. These things were allowed to saturate black life, and the byproduct of it was a shift in what it meant to be a black man, to be a father, to be a black woman, to be a mother, to be a husband, to be a wife. All these things began to shift under the weight of what was allowed to happen to us and what was made to happen to us through this crack cocaine era and the accompanying rise of the prison industrial complex. Okay, I have a caller. Caller, are you there? Please state your question or your comment.
Yes, sir. This is Ray again. I'm calling to apologize because I did misunderstand you.
No problem.
Okay, but the thing is that African American and Hispanics, since the late 1990s, have fought hard to get our aldermen, our aldermen. They're the minority, but they're majority now. But what happens? Nothing. So if there's any racism going on, you got to include the black man and the brown man, because they do nothing to help us. All they do is want your vote. So there is racism everywhere. It's just not white. Thank you, and you are right about me being wrong. Thanks again, buddy. Bye-bye.
Okay, by definition, you cannot accuse black and brown people of being racist against themselves, by definition. But you can understand, we can accept the fact that we were made, black people in particular, as chattel slaves, we were robbed of our languages, robbed of our native tongue, our names, our culture. In fact, we were tortured and brutalized if we spoke our native languages. We were tortured, brutalized, and even murdered if we practiced any of our traditions in the early parts of chattel slavery. And so by the time we reach 1865, we know nothing of ourselves. We know nothing about ourselves. And so currently today as a people, we know nothing about ourselves. We have no very, very limited connection to our culture, Okay, and so it's easy for us to imbibe the culture of the dominant society because we're not grounded to our own traditions, history, and heritage as a community. So in that way, we work against ourselves very easily because we're easily compromised without any connection to our native language, land, or traditions. Caller, go ahead.
Yes. First of all, I want to tell you that I appreciate hearing you, but there are a few things that I want to interject, having been raised in the city of Chicago and having been educated and being a part of the black movement all the way down. First of all, let me just tell you about public aid.
Please be quick. I'm running out of time. Please be quick.
Fathers out of the house. Because when the welfare workers came in, they looked for the shoes of the black man. And if there were shoes in the house, then the mothers got thrown off of public aid. Number two, grandparents were in the house. And before we looked up in the late 50s and early 60s, senior citizen buildings started popping up all over the place, getting the parents, the grandparents who were the disciplinarians in our household, moving them out. There's another thing I want to say, and he told me I only had a few minutes, and everybody knows I'm Martha Palmer, so I've been out here.
Yeah, please be quick. We're running out of time.
The movement is for female. The feminist movement is for white. The womenist movement is for black women. Black women support their black men, and they always have. And
Thank you, caller. I mentioned this last week. The practices of the Federal Housing Authority, locally and nationally, they didn't just look for shoes. They performed midnight inspections where they would come and knock on your door in the middle of the night, and you had to let them in. If there was a man there, you would lose your housing. And so many black fathers would come home late at night, and they would have to hide in a closet and hope they wouldn't be found with their family at night. So we talked about that, and I agree with you. And in fact, we've posted a story on our Facebook timeline about that. Do we have another caller? That was it? All right, very good. So we're running out of time. And so, but the caller is correct. Now, I don't totally agree with the womanism argument. I think that it is a hybrid, according to my understanding, as I've had this conversation with many black women that I consider conscious and progressive, about how you define this womanism movement. I think that we have to go all the way back to the standards of our ancient African ancestors. They didn't have a womanist movement. They were wrapped in some traditions that didn't go by those labels, and they had no problem being in their role, taking their responsibility, exerting their power and their authority in their roles as women in the village, in the community, and in the family. And so we got to get away from this hybridization of stuff that the dominant white society does for itself. We still wound up with an assault on the black male. And so I'm going to do my best in the next week, God willing, when we come back on. I want to lay out, I want to destroy this myth of the black father, the negative mythology around black men, the negative mythology around the black father, the negative mythology around the demonization of black men, and how the whole burden of the degradation, the degraded conditions in the black community are always put on the backs of black men, and how everybody, including many of our own women and children, learn to hate black men and blame us for the miserable conditions that have been produced by white male supremacy, and how we fall and are duped into drinking that Kool-Aid and how all of this connects to the perpetuation of fratricide and black-on-black violence in the black community. And so I thank those of you who've watched and called in today. Had some great calls. Please tune in next week. Come back with your criticisms, your questions, and your statements, because we want to carry this forward on next week. This is Minister Michael Muhammad signing off for the Street Peace Coalition. We hope you'll tune in to us on next week. Thank you.